Coincidence? No such thing. All happens for a reason. Operation COVID-19. From fake solution to fake crisis, COVID-19 flashback. This elaborate piece of COVID-19 political theater was the live exercise evolution of a well-rehearsed script used since the pre-9/11 dark winter pandemic simulation held in Washington in June 2001, where a cast of players, including the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff together with members of the press, performed a policy and media response to a suspected bioterrorism event. Please read and share this report on Pacific Eclipse, a pandemic tabletop exercise held in December 2019, effectively a final warm-up exercise for Operation COVID-19, which took place behind closed doors. Don't miss the 12-point summary halfway down, with pictures. An academic article on the simulation event was featured in a special edition of the medical journal Vaccine in April 2022, hiding in plain sight. Dictorial Vaccine, 2021, Mars 16, 40, 17, 474, 2475, DOI, 10-10016, J, Vaccine, 2021, 02.021, Pacific Eclipse. Before the Corona Dawn, Anthony D. Kelleher, Horn author information article notes copyright and license information, PMCID, PMC 8986154, PMID, 337366916. The Pacific Eclipse meeting was based around an immersive tabletop simulation of a multi-threat bioterrorism disaster, precipitated by the deliberate release variola virus in the South Pacific. The prescience and timeliness of this meeting, held on December 9th and 10th, 2019, was extraordinary. Within a month, those attending the meeting would be facing the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic, hopefully implementing many of the lessons learned. Pacific Eclipse predicted a range of changes that COVID-19 would bring to the globe. The prescience and timeliness of this meeting, held on December 9th and 10th, 2019, was extraordinary. Within a month, those attending the meeting would be facing the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic, hopefully implementing many of the lessons learned. Professor Anthony Kelleher, Kirby Institute, UNSW, Sydney, Australia. Yes, truly extraordinary. Is this a confession? Read on for details. Event 201, widely recognized as the COVID rehearsal, held on 18 October 2019 in NYC, is familiar to many. The pandemic tabletop exercise was hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and the World Economic Forum. Event 201. October 2019 Pacific Eclipse was a high-level, but low-profile pandemic simulation held on 9–10 December 2019, conducted by the U.S. Department of Defense in collaboration with key academic institutions in Anglosphere countries. The scenario was specifically adapted for the U.S. 2020 presidential election year. To set the scene in real life, in the words of Professor Raina McIntyre, the first author of the paper, on December 9–10, 2019, while SARS-CoV-2 began spreading in China, we ran Pacific Eclipse, a pandemic tabletop exercise, in 3 cities simultaneously in the United States. Professor Raina McIntyre, Kirby Institute, UNSW, Sydney, Australia. What an amazing coincidence. The professor continues. Pacific Eclipse brought together international stakeholders from health, defense, law enforcement, emergency management, and a range of other sectors. The exercise was designed to identify potential gaps in preparedness and modifiable factors which could prevent a pandemic or mitigate the impact of a pandemic. Sounds like a practice for a pre-planned fake pandemic. Stakeholders from state and federal government and non-government organizations from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, as well as industry and non-government organizations attended. Wow. Who were these people? Also, given the hypothetical outbreak starts in Fiji, it's an interesting mix of countries. But wait, there's more. Many issues that subsequently arose during the COVID-19 pandemic were anticipated. Testing, tracing, isolation, quarantine, vaccination response, stockpiling, social distancing, masks, border control, protecting critical infrastructure, business continuity, and protecting first responders. Pacific Eclipse took a broad, societal view of pandemics, including cascading failures in critical infrastructure due to mass illness and absenteeism, all of which were seen during the subsequent COVID-19 pandemic. The ability of these experts to anticipate a phony baloney crisis in which they're heavily invested is truly extraordinary. They even predicted the COVID scenes with cruise ships. The scenarios depicted within the Pacific Eclipse predicted the porosity of borders and that cruise liners would pose very significant logistical issues and moral dilemmas caused by the risk of disease amplification on board. Wonders never cease. And then, enter the miraculous vaccines versus vaccine hesitancy. We showed that vaccination provides an effective exit strategy to a pandemic, and that this requires high and rapid coverage, as well as vaccine to be supplied to the areas of greatest need. Countries that cannot achieve high coverage due to lack of access or hesitancy will determine the duration of the pandemic and the level of global disruption, which may extend to many years in some hotspots. No mention of real-life global vaccine failure, needless to say. Here's the bombshell. We did exercise the impact of the 2020 federal election in the US and Brexit in the UK on the smallpox pandemic, but did not anticipate the complete failure in organized public health response in these countries at critical junctures. So, without having to read between the lines, this sounds a lot like a predetermined scheme to take down the two key populist political movements in the West at that time, MAGA and Brexit, doesn't it? The degree of plotting on display is jaw-dropping. The article actually outlines how, during the exercise, real-time feedback for decisions about measures was provided by modeling, including worst-case scenario. The results were then presented in real time to the participants on the large screen and on their smartphones, and an interactive discussion followed. At the end of the exercise, people were shown mathematical modeling outputs of the epidemic resulting from different actions or decisions. In the worst-case scenario, the end of the pandemic is greater than 8 years, and results in 522 million cases, despite the vaccine being highly effective. Of course, in order to pull off a pandemic, the modeling is crucial. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, like Neil Ferguson et al.'s notorious Imperial College Report 9, we did not include formal economic analyses in the exercise, but this is also an important consideration for competing pandemic control options. Now they tell us, after crashing the global economy. Note, on the issue of origins and biothreats. According to the experts who designed the exercise, the different characteristics compared to COVID of both the culprit infection and the origin of the outbreak. In the case of Pacific Eclipse, a bioterrorism attack involving smallpox, were considered irrelevant in terms of the continuity between the simulation and real life. Although the pandemic spread of SARS-CoV-2 was not deliberate, many of the issues addressed in the meeting were and remain highly relevant to effectively managing and limiting the spread of a highly contagious infectious disease. In fact, the journal article highlights the many parallels between the Pacific Eclipse test run and the COVID-19 pandemic. The long incubation period, similar R0 and predominant respiratory transmission make the two infections comparable in pandemic potential. This provided a validation of the hypothetical pandemic we had exercised and showed that many issues highlighted by Pacific Eclipse did come to pass during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there you have it. Just before COVID kicked off in a supercharged US presidential election year, and an anticipated second term for Trump, and overwhelming momentum in the UK to get Brexit done, the Five Eyes nations held a clandestine meeting of multi-level pandemic stakeholders across government, academia, and industry, led by the US DoD and assorted university experts, and ran a tabletop exercise that more or less accurately predicted the desired COVID response of those present. Is it possible that Event 201 was a modified limited hangout, and the real tabletop exercise, Pacific Eclipse, took place later, in private, just before Operation COVID-19 was officially launched, whereby a manufactured emergency then had the anticipated effect of political destabilization, particularly in the US and the UK? This all looks very much like a smoking gun, nearly 5 years later. Read on for Pacific Eclipse, 12 points, with visual cues of the crime scene. 1. Pacific Eclipse was an interactive tabletop exercise held simultaneously in 3 U.S. cities, Washington, D.C., Phoenix, and Honolulu, on 9–10 December 2019. 2. There were over 200 invited participants from the Five Eyes nations. Participants: stakeholders from state and federal government and non-government organizations from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, as well as industry and non-government organizations attended. 3. The exercise was jointly conducted by the DoD United States Indo-Pacific Command, USINDOPACOM, the PLUS Alliance of 3 universities in the US, ASU, the UK, KCL, and Australia, UNSW. 4. The scenario was developed by Professor Raina McIntyre, a physician and researcher in emerging infectious diseases and biosecurity at the Kirby Institute at UNSW, Sydney, Australia. It was based on a smallpox outbreak resulting from a bioterror attack in Fiji that evolves into a global pandemic. 5. The meeting was officially opened by Rear Admiral Louis Tripoli, Command Surgeon of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and Professor Anthony Kelleher, Director of the Kirby Institute, University of Ness Dollars, Australia. 6. Digital communications for the event, considered highly sensitive, were sponsored and provided by Secured Communications, LLC. It was absolutely essential that the mobile communication between our 3 locations be protected and encrypted because of the very sensitive nature of the exercise, said Dr. Raina McIntyre, Professor of Global Biosecurity and NHMRC Principal Research Fellow at the Kirby Institute, UNSW Sydney, and organizer of Pacific Eclipse. 7. Pacific Eclipse received funding for venue hire, participant travel and accommodation from vaccine companies, Emergent Biosolutions, and Bavarian Nordic, and SIGA and Meridian Medical Technologies. 8. On 21 January 2020, the tabletop exercise was reported in the news section of the Kirby Institute UNSW website. Note: this university news report mentioned that invited participants included representatives from the WHO, US CDC, US military, FBI, London Metropolitan Police, Defence Science Technology Laboratories UK, and several state and international agencies. The event was also reported at Cision PR Web on 4 March 2020 as news provided by Secured Communications, which noted simulation findings predictive of key aspects of the current coronavirus epidemic. 9. In December 2021, 2 years after the event, Professor Raina McIntyre tweeted about the online publication of her article on Pacific Eclipse. 10. The script was modified specifically for the US context with the assistance of ASU. The scenario began in Fiji and was adapted for the US context. The narrative focused on America and included the 2020 US presidential election. As the pandemic takes hold, critical infrastructure and supply chains are compromised, and there are shortages of medical equipment, masks, respirators, antivirals, and vaccines in the US. International aid is greatly reduced because the US needs their resources and personnel for their own epidemic control. Crisis communication is an issue, and not done well. Conspiracy theories and anti-vaccination groups are also active on social media. Civil unrest and riots occur in many cities, requiring law enforcement and military response, but shortages of personal protective equipment have police striking. The upcoming federal election in 2020 also becomes a factor, with politicization of the pandemic response and nationalism. Banning of mass gatherings such as concerts and sporting events becomes contentious, as does border control. Large outbreaks begin in California and Arizona, and the disease spreads more widely. Absenteeism in the workforce is affecting the economy severely. Dead bodies outside hospitals are piling up, and disposal of medical waste is in crisis, as funeral homes are full or refusing service and transport companies refuse medical waste. The population is confused, further reducing trust in authority and government. 11. The article outlines how the exercise included mitigation measures such as contract tracing, social distancing, border closures, and speed of vaccination response. Factors modifying epidemic severity included cultural biases and political leadership. Pacific Eclipse was underpinned by mathematical modeling research to provide realistic epidemic outcomes under different scenarios and resulting from different decisions and resource allocation. 12. The discussion section of the article explicitly raises the issue of COVID measures including lockdowns, masks, and vaccine mandates, and attributes resistance to these to modifiable cultural factors, and political leadership. The editorial highlights the importance of buy-in as central to any pandemic response. From the editorial, Pacific Eclipse also highlighted the requirement for a responsive, responsible, and facilitatory political environment in order for these plans and agencies to be effective. However, all the preparedness on the part of health, defense, and police forces, first responders, and others will not remedy a lack of political will to deploy and support these responses and to communicate clearly with the public at large. Without public buy-in, even the best-laid plans will not succeed and are likely to be undermined. The need to take the political classes with us on these journeys is a hurdle that needs to be cleared. 2020 has taught us that this hurdle can extremely be high. Jurisdictions where there is vacillating, ineffective, or obstructive political support for evidence-based responses have failed dismally and will fail to control future threats of highly infectious pathogens, whether they are released on purpose as part of a bioterrorism threat or are naturally occurring pathogens. Professor Anthony Kelleher. The COVID-19 coup. This event in part explains the transnational, lockstep, coordinated response that was seen in mid-March 2020 across public and private sectors, and at other stages of the pandemic, including the push for a whole-of-society approach. Behind the scenes, everyone was literally on the same page, and maybe the same WhatsApp group, and on a war footing. Was the coup against major Western democracies game-planned at Pacific Eclipse? The secretive and prescient military-led tabletop exercise and its subsequent delayed reporting in a journal, more than 2 years into the pandemic, raises many questions about the foreknowledge and foreplanning of Operation COVID-19 and the wider geopolitical agenda at play. To be continued. P.S. Please consider sharing this article to help disseminate the information to as many people as possible ASAP. And/or feel free to use any images or quotes for posts and tweets, etc. Acknowledgements. Many thanks to fellow Australian Elizabeth Hart at Vaccination is Political for her support and advice with this blog in 2024, and her invaluable input for this post. Thanks also to Sasha Latipova at Due Diligence and Art for promoting the work of this Substack, and for raising awareness about the central role of the U.S. Department of Defense in the COVID response, despite all the pushback. The masses are arising to such madness, no such thing as coincidence. This has been orchestrated on purpose by those in powerful places. The usual suspects, the 1%ers, dark deep state criminals, gangsters of government. It is time for the masses to be told and wake up to the truth. Love, peace, unity, and light in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.